There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside an apartment when you have been alone for too long. Not the peaceful kind, not the silence of a Sunday morning with coffee and birdsong drifting through an open window. This silence has texture. It presses against your chest like something unfinished. It sits in the corners of rooms you barely enter. It follows you from the kitchen to the bathroom mirror and waits there while you look at a face that has grown, somehow, unfamiliar. I am 43 years old as I write this. I am sitting at the same desk where I have sat for the better part of 2 decades, in the same city, in the same neighborhood, and yet I feel like a man who has only recently begun to understand the house he has been living in all along. This is not a dramatic story. There are no great turning points, no single shattering moment that cracked everything open and rearranged the pieces. What I am about to share is something much quieter than that, a slow accumulation of small realizations, private moments, and gentle discoveries that, taken together, have changed the way I understand myself, my needs, and what it means to feel at home in one's own skin. I want to go back to the beginning, or at least to what feels like the beginning in hindsight, though of course nothing ever truly begins at the moment we think it does. Things begin earlier than we notice. They begin in the small discomforts we dismiss because we have no language for them yet. I was 26 when I first remember feeling what I can only describe as a persistent emotional fatigue. I had a good job, the kind of job people called stable, which I later understood to mean the kind of job that asks you to keep a great deal of yourself very quiet in order to function within it. I worked in logistics coordination for a mid-sized firm. I was responsible for spreadsheets, timelines, the smooth passage of things from one place to another. There was a rhythm to it, and for a while the rhythm was enough. But rhythm, I learned, is not the same as meaning. And efficiency is not the same as expression. I had grown up in a household where the rules of conduct were not spoken aloud, so much as simply understood. My father was a practical man, admirable in many ways, who communicated through actions rather than feelings. My mother was warm, but there was a kind of emotional shorthand in our family that meant certain inner landscapes simply went unexplored. You finished your plate. You finished your homework. You made your way through the world with competence and without complaint, because complaint was indulgence, and indulgence was a weakness no one could afford. I absorbed these values thoroughly, perhaps too thoroughly. At 26, I was efficient and competent and completely unable to tell anyone, including myself, that I was profoundly, quietly, exhaustingly sad. The sadness was not clinical, or if it was, I never sought to find out. It was more of a low-grade dimness, as though someone had turned the brightness down on a screen that was otherwise functioning perfectly. From the outside, I was fine. I went to work. I went to the gym occasionally. I met colleagues for drinks on Friday evenings and laughed at the right moments, and never once mentioned that when I came home to my apartment afterward, I sometimes sat on the edge of my bed for 20 minutes without turning on the light. I want to be careful here not to overdramatize. I was not in crisis. I was not suffering in any way that would have been visible or that deserved emergency attention. What I was experiencing was something millions of people experience and never give a name to, the slow erosion of a self that was never quite fully assembled in the first place. I was lonely, not in the way that is solved by company. I had company, but in the way that comes from not being fully known. From not fully knowing yourself. It was in this period that I first began to notice small things. Preferences that seemed, at the time, peculiar and disconnected. I noticed that I lingered in certain aisles at the pharmacy. I noticed that I found the texture of certain fabrics unusually comforting. I noticed that I sometimes slowed down on the sidewalk outside particular shop windows not because I wanted to buy anything, but because something in the arrangement of colors and softness on display produced in me a warmth I could not easily locate anywhere else in my life. I did not think much of these observations. I filed them under the general heading of oddness and moved on. That is what we do with the things we are not yet ready to understand. We notice them, and then we look away. But they stay. That is the important thing. They stay exactly where they were, patient and unhurried, waiting for us to have enough light to see them clearly. The first time I held a woman's blouse in my hands in a way that was not accidental, I was 29 years old, and I was doing laundry. My neighbor at the time, A kind and somewhat scattered woman named Marianne, who worked as a secondary school art teacher, had accidentally left a bag of her laundry outside the wrong door. We shared a landing on the third floor of our building, and the doors were identically positioned, and she had been in a hurry, and so her bag ended up outside my door instead of hers. When I discovered it and looked inside to identify the owner, there were a few items with her name written in permanent marker on the care labels, as teachers sometimes do. I found myself holding a pale green blouse made of something smooth and lightweight. I don't know how long I stood in my hallway holding it. Long enough that I felt self-conscious about it afterward, even though no one was watching. There was something about the weight of it, or rather the absence of weight. The way it draped across my palm like water finding its own level. Something in me responded to that quality in a way that felt almost like recognition. Like hearing a piece of music you have never heard before, but that somehow sounds like a place you have been. I returned the bag to Marianne promptly. I did not think about the blouse again for several weeks. But I thought about the feeling. I was not, at this stage of my life, doing anything that could reasonably be called self-exploration. I was doing the opposite. I was working longer hours. I had received a promotion that added new responsibilities and subtracted new hours from the part of my life that was already not being fully lived. I had begun a relationship with a woman, a thoughtful, perceptive woman named Claire, that I entered into with genuine warmth, and that nonetheless quietly confirmed for me something I had been slowly sensing, that I was not always fully present, even when I was present. That there was a room inside me I kept locked not out of secrecy, but simply because I had lost the key and was not entirely sure where I had left it. Claire and I ended things after 14 months, without bitterness. She said, kindly and accurately, that she sometimes felt like she was having a conversation with 90% of a person. I did not disagree. I could not explain the other 10% because I did not yet know what it contained. After Claire, I began, entirely by accident and without any particular intention, to pay more careful attention to my own comfort. This sounds simple. It was not simple. It was actually one of the most unfamiliar things I had ever attempted. I started small. I bought better sheets. This sounds ridiculous, but it was significant. I had been sleeping on adequate sheets for years. Utilitarian. Perfectly sufficient. One afternoon, I walked into a home goods shop intending to buy a replacement power strip and walked out 40 minutes later with a set of sheets made from Egyptian cotton, in a color described on the label as soft sage, which I would previously have dismissed as an unnecessary indulgence, and which turned out to make an almost embarrassing difference to the quality of my sleep. I started paying attention to texture in other areas. I bought a robe, the kind of robe I had always considered excessive, and wore it on weekend mornings. I began using a better moisturizer. I lit a candle occasionally in the evenings, something I had previously associated with other people's apartments, with lives that seemed cushioned against the sharpness of the world in ways mine was not. These were acts of self-care so elementary that writing them down feels almost comical. But I want to be honest about the sequence of things, because I think the sequence matters. The sequence is where the story actually lives. What I was doing, though I could not have articulated it at the time, was beginning to give myself permission to care about my own comfort. That might sound like nothing. For someone who had spent nearly 3 decades treating comfort as optional and emotional softness as something to be rationed carefully, it was enormous. It was in this atmosphere of slowly expanding permission that I began, gradually and with a great deal of private ambivalence, to explore what I can now call the quieter registers of my own identity. I did not rush toward anything. I circled the edges of things for months. I remember standing in a department store I had gone to buy a belt and spending a long time in a part of the floor I had no professional reason to be in. Not staring. Not lingering conspicuously. Just moving slowly, taking in textures and colors, the way you do in an art gallery when you are not sure which painting you are looking for, but you know you will recognize it. Something in me was looking for a language I did not yet have words for. I was beginning to understand that the 10% Claire had noticed missing was not missing. It had never been missing. It had simply been kept very, very quiet. And it was slowly starting to make sound. I'm going to tell you about the bra now, though I have to tell you first what the bra was not. It was not a fetish object. It was not a costume, not a disguise. not a performance for anyone, including myself. I want to be clear about this because I think clarity matters here, and because I spent a great deal of time being muddled about it, and the muddlement was entirely unnecessary and entirely self-imposed. I was 32. I had moved to a slightly larger apartment, same building, one floor up, and in the course of moving I had reorganized my closet with an ambition that exceeded my follow-through, so there were boxes partially unpacked that sat in the corner of my bedroom for longer than I like to admit. In one of these boxes, beneath some books I had been meaning to donate for years, I found a bra. It had belonged to a former girlfriend, a brief relationship from my late 20s that had ended on good terms, and had been left behind so long ago that its presence in my belongings was genuinely archaeological. I had no memory of keeping it, no memory of packing it. It was simply there, a simple, unlined, ivory-colored bra with thin straps and a small eyelet pattern along the underwire seam. I held it in the same way I had held Marianne's blouse 3 years earlier, with the same stillness, the same quality of attention. And then, and this is the part one want to describe as carefully as I can, because it is the part that changed something, I put it on. Not all at once. Not with any dramatic decision or statement of intent to myself. I simply reached behind me in the quiet of my bedroom on a Saturday afternoon with gray light coming through the curtains, and I fastened it, and I stood there. I am aware of how this might read. I am aware that there are people for whom this would require no explanation, and others for whom it would invite immediate categorization. I am not interested in either response, particularly. What I am interested in is describing what actually happened in that moment, as honestly as I can manage. What happened was this. Something in me went quiet in a completely different way than the quiet I was used to. The quiet I was used to was the quiet of suppression. The quiet of rooms where certain conversations never happened. The quiet of a self that had learned to take up exactly as much space as was required and no more. This was a different quiet. It was the quiet of something settling, of something being, however tentatively, permitted. I did not make anything of it that afternoon. I took it off after perhaps 10 minutes, folded it, and put it in a drawer. I made dinner. I watched something forgettable on television. I went to bed, but I thought about it for weeks. Not with shame, exactly, though shame visited occasionally, as it tends to when you have been taught that certain things require justification. Mostly I thought about it with the focused, almost academic curiosity of someone who has encountered a problem they do not yet have the framework to solve. I began reading. Not searching for permission, I want to be clear about that, but searching for understanding. I read about gender expression and identity, about the history of clothing and what it has meant across different cultures and periods, about the psychological dimensions of comfort and self-representation. I read personal accounts written by people who described experiences that rhymed with mine in various ways, and I found in those accounts not a blueprint, but a kind of company. The company of recognition. Over the following months, I began, very slowly, to build what I think of now as a private vocabulary of self. I bought a few things. Carefully, thoughtfully, without urgency. A soft camisole in a deep burgundy that I wore sometimes on evenings when I was at home and wanted to feel, as I had begun to think of it, like myself. A pair of smooth, fitted pajama bottoms in a fabric that felt like permission. A lightweight cardigan with a drape that I wore on weekends with complete normalcy and complete private satisfaction. I was not performing anything. I was not being anything in the declarative sense. I was simply, and I use this word very deliberately, comfortable. This was new. This was so new that for a while I was not sure what to do with it. Comfort as a sustained state was not something I had had much practice living inside. I began to notice that the evenings I spent at home in these small, private ways, putting on the things that felt soft and right, making tea, reading, allowing myself to exist in my own apartment as something other than a temporary resident waiting to go back to work, were evenings I felt less eroded, less like a person who was being subtracted from. I began to sleep better. I began, in small ways, to be kinder to myself during the day. The self-criticism that had been the background music of my inner life for so many years, the constant low murmur of not quite enough, not quite right, began to lose some of its authority. I want to be careful not to attribute all of this to a single source. I was also, around this time, getting more sleep, eating better, and had begun taking short evening walks, which the accumulated evidence of human history suggests are quietly excellent for the soul. These things are not separable. They are all part of the same movement, the movement of a person who has decided, without quite deciding it, to take their own inner life seriously. But the private rituals of self-expression were part of it. They were, I think, the part that surprised me most. They were the part that told me something I had not known I needed to hear, that I was allowed to exist in a way that felt genuinely mine. By the time I was 37, the private had become simply personal. I mean this in a specific sense. What had begun as something I held quietly and carefully, something I examined from a slight distance as though it might be startled away, had become simply a part of how I lived. The way certain people take long baths as a matter of course, or spend Sunday mornings painting, or cook elaborate meals they eat alone with a glass of wine and no apology. It had become an unremarkable part of the texture of my days. Unremarkable in the best possible sense, in the sense of having been absorbed into the ordinary, having been metabolized by the self that was using it as nourishment. I had also, by this point, begun the work of understanding the shape of my own emotional life with considerably more care than I had previously invested. I started seeing a therapist, not in response to a crisis, but because I had read enough and thought enough to understand that talking to someone trained in the architecture of inner experience might help me put words to what I had been building without a blueprint. My therapist was a quiet, observant woman with a collection of succulents on her windowsill and the gift of asking questions that felt simple and were not. In our first session, she asked me what I found most difficult about the way I lived. I told her about the loneliness. She asked what kind. I said the kind that persists even when you are not alone. She nodded in the manner of someone who has heard this before and still finds it worth hearing again. Over months of sessions, I began to understand the specific architecture of my own suppression, how it had been built, which walls were structural and which were cosmetic, which rooms I had avoided because they were genuinely dangerous, and which ones I had simply told myself were off-limits because it was easier than furnishing them. I want to be clear that I never presented my therapist with a single grand confession or a revelation. It was more gradual than that. More like a restoration project than a demolition. One conversation at a time, I began to understand that the person I had been slowly becoming in the privacy of my apartment, the person who wore soft things and lit candles and had stopped treating his own comfort as an unearned luxury, was not a different person from the one who went to work and managed spreadsheets and made competent decisions. He was the same person, more of the same person, an extended version. This might sound obvious. It was not obvious to me. It took time and patience and a great deal of sitting with discomfort before I could see it clearly. What I also began to understand, with the help of those sessions and my own gradually expanding self-literacy, was that my relationship to clothing and texture and softness was not a secret kept for myself, but a signal I had been sending myself for years, a signal I had been too trained in a particular kind of self-dismissal to receive properly. The signal was not complicated. It was not asking for anything extraordinary. It was simply saying, there are ways of being in the world that feel more like you than others. Pay attention to them. Let them teach you something. I have since come to think of this as one of the more important pieces of information I have ever received, and the fact that it came from inside myself does not diminish its significance. It enlarges it. I began to extend the same quality of attention I had been applying to my private life to the rest of my life as well. I became more selective about how I spent my time and with whom. I became more honest, not confessionally so, not in ways that required other people to manage my inner life, but in the quieter, more durable sense of no longer performing emotions I did not feel or pretending to prefer things I did not prefer. I became, in small ways that compounded, more present, more like someone who was actually in the room he occupied. The loneliness did not disappear. I do not want to suggest a fairy tale resolution. That did not occur. But its quality changed. It became less like a deficit, less like the feeling of something being absent, and more like a condition I had learned to keep company with, to coexist with without being diminished by it. I began to make friends more slowly, and keep them longer. I became a better friend myself, more patient, more genuinely interested, less anxious about the performance of friendship as opposed to the substance of it. I think this change came, in part, from having become less of a stranger to myself. When you know your own interior better, navigating someone else's becomes less frightening. I also began, gradually, to be less concerned with the question of what things meant and more interested in the question of how things felt. This shift from meaning to experience, from justification to simply inhabiting, was perhaps the deepest change of this period. I stopped needing to have a complete explanation for myself in order to be allowed to be myself. I stopped treating my own inner life as a problem requiring a solution and started treating it as a landscape worth knowing. There is a phrase I came across in something I was reading during this time. I cannot now remember the exact source, that has stayed with me. The self does not require permission to be curious about itself. I wrote it on a small card and kept it on my desk for a long time. I may have needed to see it every day for a year before I genuinely believed it, but I came to believe it. That was the important thing. I am writing this on a Friday evening in late autumn. Outside my window, the city is doing what cities do, moving, making sound, arranging and rearranging itself in the particular rhythm of a weekday ending and a weekend beginning. Inside, I have made tea. There is a low light on. I am wearing a soft merino cardigan over a smooth-fitted shirt in a deep blue-gray that I bought because I liked it and that fits in a way that feels easy and right, and I am sitting at my desk in the same unremarkable, irreplaceable way that I sit here most evenings now. I am going to try to describe what clarity feels like because I think it is often described badly, as a sudden illumination, a dramatic awakening, a moment where everything snaps into focus like a lens being adjusted. In my experience, it is nothing like that. Clarity, as I have come to understand it, feels like the absence of a particular noise. It feels like the moment when you realize you have not thought about a specific anxiety for several days. It feels like waking up and not immediately beginning the low-grade audit of your own adequacy. It feels like sitting in your own apartment on a Friday evening and finding that the silence is the good kind, the kind with birdsong in it, or the city equivalent of birdsong, the kind of ambient human sound that reminds you are part of something without requiring you to perform for it. I am not a transformed person in the dramatic sense. I have not reinvented myself or arrived at some conclusive new identity that requires announcement. I am the same person I have always been. The same person who sat on the edge of his bed in the dark at 26, who held a stranger's blouse in a hallway at 29, who stood alone in his bedroom at 32 holding an old, ivory-colored bra and finding in that moment something he could not yet name but recognized nonetheless. I am that person, continued, extended, more fully inhabited. The bra, and I return to it now to give this story its proper center, was never really about the bra. I understood this fairly early, though understanding something intellectually and integrating it emotionally are different timelines. What it was about was permission. What it was about was the discovery that certain gestures, certain textures, certain private acts of self-expression could function as a kind of interior kindness, a way of saying to yourself, I see you. I am not going to require you to be less than what you are. I still wear soft things. I still light candles in the evenings. I have a small, carefully assembled collection of garments that exist in the space between what is publicly gendered and what is simply comfortable, and I wear them in the privacy of my home with the same calm that I have come to bring to most things, not as acts of hidden rebellion or confession, but as acts of self-care in the most literal sense. The care of a self that I have, over a long time and with a great deal of patience, learned to take seriously. I think about identity differently now than I did at 26. Then, I understood identity as something fixed, something you had or did not have, something conferred by circumstance and confirmed by behavior. Now I understand it as something more like a practice, something you return to, again and again, with different tools and different levels of light, and each time you look, you see something you had not quite seen before. The loneliness I described at the beginning of the story has not entirely left me. I do not think it ever entirely leaves anyone who has known it, but it has changed its character. It is less like a deficit now, less like a room with something missing from it, and more like a particular quality of solitude, the kind that has been chosen rather than suffered, inhabited rather than endured. I am, for the first time in as long as I can remember, genuinely comfortable being alone with myself. This is not a small thing. This is, I would argue, one of the largest things a person can be. There are people in my life who know parts of this story, and people who do not. That distribution feels right to me. I am not in the business of requiring other people to understand everything about me in order for me to feel legitimate. That particular need, the need to be fully understood by someone else before I could fully understand myself, was something I had to give up, and giving it up was one of the great reliefs of my adult life. What I know, sitting here at 43 with my tea and my low light, and the city making its reasonable sound outside, I know that the self is more patient than we give it credit for. It will wait, for years if necessary, for us to have enough quiet and enough courage to hear what it has been trying to say. I know that comfort is not indulgence, that softness is not weakness, that the private rituals through which we care for ourselves, however they look, however they might read to an observer who does not have the context, are not frivolous. They are the small, daily architecture of a life that is genuinely lived from the inside. I know that transformation does not always announce itself. Sometimes it moves like light moving across a room in the course of a long afternoon, so gradually that you do not notice it until you look up and realize everything has changed color and the whole room is different from how it was, and somehow warmer. I am different from how I was. I am warmer. That is enough. That is, in fact, exactly enough.